So today I'm very excited to introduce my dear colleague in the English department, Dr. Caddie Alford, whose new book entitled Opinions, Doxa After Digitality was recently published by the University of Alabama Press. Congratulations on this wonderful achievement. And I would also like to mention that Dr. Alford is one of our residential HRC fellows this year, already working on a new project, Rhetorical Restoration, a Paradigm of Repair for the Art Aftermath of Digitality. More on that project later. Dr. Alford is Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Writing in the Department of English here at VCU and an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Her rhetorical studies research interrogates emerging social media forms of persuasion and sociality, such as how the techniques of private Facebook groups radicalize publics, of how digitality intensifies fascist appeals. Her new book addresses social media rhetorics by creating an affirmative theory of opinions to identify and to reclaim a spectrum of truths and their actions. Some of her work has been published in the Quarterly Journal of Speech, Rhetoric Review, and Enculturation. She served as a book review editor for the Journal Enculturation for 3 years and is currently co-editing a rhetorical studies collection on post-truth, very relevant topic, especially in an election year, post-truth rhetoric as they intersect with and inform digitality, politics, epistemologies, health, and so on. Dr. Alford, congratulations on your book and welcome to Meet VCU Authors.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for attending. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see my slides? Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm so grateful to the HRC, Dr. Christina Stanchu, Ronnie Sisavith for putting these talks together. It's really important to champion works in the humanities, obviously, and works in general. So thank you all. I'm excited to share takeaways from my recent book entitled Opinions, Doxa After Digitality, which I published under University of Alabama's new series, Rhetoric Plus Digitality. My book is one of the first 3 to be published under that series, and I was really excited to publish with them because they really understand that rhetoric is conditioned by digitality just as much as digitality is conditioned by rhetoric. And they were also interested in promoting models of theory building, which I really was excited about because when you're in the kind of humanities, social sciences, you might notice that work on social media, it tends to be kind of quantitative or kind of technical communication based. And I wanted it to be philosophical. I wanted it to be theoretical and really kind of intellectually rich. So I was really excited about this series when it came out. My book is a rhetorical studies response to our urgent post-truth era to make sense out of the contemporary scene between facts, truths, and opinions, and how big tech intensifies that scene into styles of fascism and reactionary extremism. Drawing on social media phenomena and logics, I argue that opinions have always been more robust, inventive, and less studied than truth. So in our time together, I will introduce the book project more generally, dive into specific examples, and then I'll leave you a taste of how this apparatus can kind of respond to contemporary examples and contemporary phenomena regarding kind of the future of rhetorical studies and digital studies. So a quick note about the cover. As many of you know who have published academic books, we don't get a lot of say in terms of what the cover looks like. But I was able to kind of say, look, I don't want anything literal, right? I don't want like a hashtag or a phone image, right? I want it to be abstract. And I think they did a good job. You know, I think it's kind of evocative of like cables and networks, and there's almost a politics of intimacy there where some of them are touching but just barely, almost, right? Also the color, it reads more yellow on the screen, which does, I think, evoke the color of a group like the Proud Boys, which is a radical extremist alt-right group. And I think my book is very interested in how those groups form, right? And also, if you look at Matthew Gould's edited collection, Debates in the Digital Humanities, you'll see almost the exact same pixelation happening, which is kind of a nice callback. And as well as the millennial coded kind of way of formatting the aesthetics on an Instagram story. So I think there's a lot going on with the cover that I appreciate from the publisher's design. So let's get into it, and I will riff along the way. Many of our most urgent contemporary issues, demagoguery, white ethno-nationalism, the circulation of myths, disinformation, compel us to take opinions seriously. To do that, we must take social media seriously, because in many ways, social media and opinions have become synonymous. Critiques of social media are often also critiques of surround sound perspectives. If we are more aware of opinions now than we have ever been, it is because of social media. There is a poetic parallel here. Both social media and opinions are similarly black boxed, considered obvious, silly, and part of an unproblematic backdrop. Of course, that is not true. And here are some examples about kind of the urgency of the digital media landscape, right? So recently, I mean, this is literally September 19th, 2024, the FTC just released a 4-year study finding out that, you know, what we all know, social media is a surveillance business, full stop, completely violating our privacy. And they looked at 11 different platforms owned by 9 different companies. And what they realized, and what this report is offering, is these companies are keeping data for far too long. They're collecting data on children, right? And when they can't get data, they participate in super shady practices involving data brokers. Private discussion groups on discourse are giving way to extreme misogyny. Regarding generative AI, Dr. Mel Hogan writes, the political underpinnings that drive notions of progress through extractivist technologies is largely a project of understated white supremacist big tech totalitarianism. Of course, Dr. Sophia Emoji-Noble's work underscores that racist and sexist stereotypes of group identities gain traction because of Google searches. Large language models are making it easy to cobble together instructions for biological weaponry. And in general, algorithms that we were told to think of as objective are constituting what we understand as knowledge. Here are just a few more kind of alarming headlines for you, right? All of this is to say that we are right to be worried about the synchronicity between opinions, values, digitality, and technology studies broadly. Opinions start to seem troubling right around the time of another technological development. And that makes sense, right? Technological developments kind of expand the number of narratives and rumors in circulation, closing the distance between time and cultures, and even revealing previously obscure or naturalized mechanisms of power. All of that affects the intensity of public opinion. From the printing press to automation, each technological shift ends up exposing just how ubiquitous yet underestimated opinions really are. And currently, as we all know, it's social media that is casting a reductive light on opinions. Now, I always use this because I really do think that The Big Lebowski kind of sums it up in a nutshell, right? This is the contemporary baggage with opinions. These days, the phrase, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, has become cliche and louder than ever. And I think that that signals people are feeling really defensive about their opinions, but they're also feeling really disdainful of opinions that they don't agree with. Opinions have been reduced to propositional beliefs and preferences that divide us from them and me from you. Opinions are discredited as uninformed and biased. They go without saying until suddenly they have to be said really loudly and they shut a conversation down, right? And we each feel entitled to stubborn opinions as these kind of possessions without having spent any time interrogating just what are opinions, right? And what do they help us do? And I guess my book kind of starts with the question of like, how did we get here, right? Like we all have opinions. Why are they so demonized? And also why are they being kind of weaponized and exploited, et cetera? So while it is the case that social media platform techniques exploit and transform opinions, platforms also expand what can be learned about opinions and vice versa. If we think of social media as the rhetorical figure of the enthymeme, which is Aristotelian reasoning that relies on the audience anticipating the conclusion's unspoken premise, then social media's implicit substance would be opinions. And you guessed it, vice versa. So my research treats this particular post-truth moment as less of a problem and more as an invitation to finally create an expansive and affirmative theory of opinions. Opinions are entitled to more. To address these issues, my book repurposes the ancient Greek term for opinions, doxa. Doxa is often translated as opinion, but it originally harbored such meanings and implications as conjecture, fame, reputation, and seemingness, right? Like all of what seems to be the case. In the modern era, doxa has also been associated with ideology, most notably in the work of Pierre Bourdieu and Roland Barthes. This rich constellation of meanings stretches what opinions are and what they can do. The conditions and gradations in which doxa as a term was coined are incredibly important to any exploration that would put opinions into conversation with social media rhetorics. So given that ancient Greek thinking has overshadowed doxa's trajectory through the European intellectual history, my book pulls from ancient Greek thinking and the subsequent accumulation of interpretations so that I can responsibly grasp a lot of these complexities. So let's just start with this, right? It should tell you a lot that doxa has an entry in the dictionary of untranslatables, right? Doxa as a concept is, once you start getting into it, it is wildly complicated. It spans a huge range of values from the most negative to the most positive, right? If you think about false opinion or hallucination to what do we expect? What's acceptable? What's conjecture, right? Maybe even deceptive appearance to, appearance in all of its glory. Somehow, and this is something that's really fascinating, doxa conveys that moment where opinions and reputation occur at the same time, right? Because your opinion of me is kind of your objective reality. That becomes my reputation as I am offering up an opinion to you. It's really an interesting objective subjective outlier, right? And I love at the bottom of this entry, right? It writes, the common translation of doxa as opinion obviously does not get all that across. So doxa for me changed the game, right? You take doxa and you apply it to what we think we understand about opinions, and it changes the message of opinions and the message of digitality. Doxa and its interpretive context help to shed some of the baggage associated with opinions, while also signaling a lot more inquiry, right? For example, Aristotle actually kind of thought of opinions as the given, which I think is a nice affirmative way to kind of start, because obviously the given are gifts, right? They're literally gifts and inheritances. And we need those gifts like clichés, for instance, or values or value systems. We need those in order to participate as civic agents, or if we just want to, respond to a group chat, right? We need opinions to allow us to do rhetoric's traditional tasks. In fact, the very disciplinary position of rhetoric begins with debates over opinion's relationship to knowledge. Distinctions in antiquity between knowledge, so Plato's episteme, and opinions write the through line for rhetoric, and it kind of marks a fissure between philosophy and rhetoric, or between using Plato or Aristotle as an origin point, though that's not the only origin point you could use, right? You could look at the great translation movement from Greek to Arabic, thinking about how some of those texts were translated, what gets added, what gets changed or remediated, etc. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen, School of Athens, famous work, and at the center we have these two dead old white men, right? And one of them is pointing upward and one of them is kind of gesturing to the people in front. And the person pointing upward is kind of a representation of Plato, right? And this is a philosophy that feels like we need to get the heck out of Dodge if we're going to pursue capital T truth, if we're going to pursue kind of the original concept of beauty, for instance, or justice. And then we have the person who's gesturing toward the people, toward the group. And that's Aristotle, and kind of signifying what rhetoric has always been interested in, which is human messiness, right? How do we come to agreement or consensus on things without resorting to violence? Although, of course, you can trouble the violence inherent in something like persuasion or coercion, right? So, from this like rich history, I kind of always struggle to understand why nowadays opinions are cast into a binary between opinions and facts. It's so much more complicated than that, right? One of my book's contributions to the post-truth era is that the term doxa, it really allows us to think in terms of a continuum of opinions, right? And what I'm going to be positing today is that there are actually gradations of opinions, from technically implausible opinions to opinions that connect the individual to the network, and finally to widely accepted social truths. So just to kind of give you a sense of what these terms look like together and what I define them as, first we have doxa, and these are the opinions that they might be a little idiosyncratic, they might be specific to you, right? But if I were to give expression to an opinion like that, you might not agree with me, but you can kind of see, okay, I understand where that person is coming from. I understand what community might have led to that opinion, what experience, what context, right? And there would probably be, you wouldn't think this literally, but there'd be a sense of like, oh, I'm sure other people think that too, right? Then we have endoxa, and this is kind of what Aristotle thought we should probably start with in order to get the ball rolling. It's kind of, okay, given this community, what's something I can say or rely on that people are probably not going to argue too much about, right? We can start there and complicate it further from there. But at the end of the day, starting there is a great place. I do this with VCU students, and I'm not going to say what the NDoxa is. Like if I go into a VCU student, into a classroom with VCU students, like what is the thing that I can say that we can kind of all agree on and laugh about and then move forward, right? That's always a fun exercise. And then things get complicated, right? We have adoxa. Now that A in front of doxa marks it as an alpha privative, which are, if you see kind of Greek words that have an A in front of them, like apathy, for instance, there's the sense that there is a different kind of relationship to the Greek word itself. Here, it's not so much that it's completely against doxa or completely opposed to doxa. It's that these opinions are widely unacceptable. So these are widely kind of rejected. If you say them, it might give pause, right? It's definitely not publicly, probably, decorous, right? So we'll come back to that in a second because it does require some teasing out. But here are a couple more from my book that are kind of wild, and I'm not going to get into them so much here. But Doxa is a philosophical liberty taken by Husserl that then got kind of adopted by Deleuze. And what these are these opinions that kind of act like original opinions, like original kind of foundational concepts. Something like the term BIPOC, for instance, is useful for doing some work, but it might start to, and arguably is, its shelf life is coming to an end, right? And so you can kind of think about these like originary propositions that of course are not originary actually, but act in that way. Universal judgments, also kind of strange, but the way I think about this in the book is Instagram slideshows. So in 2020, right, with the murder of George Floyd, we had a lot of people using the carousel feature on Instagram to promote social justice activities and thoughts and concepts. And you could look at it and be like, oh yeah, I agree with that, right? Like I'm sure a lot of people agree with that. One of the slideshows might be, fat phobia is a serious problem, and like I would look at that and be like, yeah, it really is. It's one of the lasting forms of discrimination that we really really need to tackle. But it might be aesthetically kind of wrapped up in a millennial aesthetic of like neutral political vibes, and by that I mean like the neutral fonts, the fonts that are used, or the appeals that are used to work with the algorithm and what the algorithm wants. And you kind of have to ask yourself, well, I agree with the premise, but the delivery is not beside the point. As rhetoricians know, the delivery is very much part of the point. So if it's wrapped up in like a neutral tone or aesthetics, like how do I feel about that, right? So a doxa has some definitional cues from Aristotle's Topics. In general, right, this is generally unacceptable. It might seem pretty absurd to somebody who's hearing it, right? It could also imply that the character of that person is up for questioning. Maybe it seems a little fragile. If you were to start to dig into it, it might give way pretty immediately, right? This is not a common term of art in the Western rhetorical tradition, but I argue in my work, you cannot be working on social media without some concept of opinions that are technically implausible, right? Technically unsubstantiated. These are kind of absurd statements cultivated in private. And so they occupy this really interesting place between knowing and not knowing, right? And we all kind of have them. So here's an example. If you were to look at a news article about climate change, you might see a comment like this, right? If humans are causing global warming, Mars would not be getting warmer too, but it is. Photos of disappearing polar ice caps over the generations prove it, right? This is undeveloped, to say the least. It's without repute if you looked at it in the broader context of the article, without relevance, without status. You might kind of laugh or chuckle if somebody says that around you. And following Hannah Arendt's logic, no opinion can exist in private. So of what appears to me that all of us possess is probably often, in fact, a doxa or has a doxastic elements to it. So again, a spectrum of doxa, and here are some of the broader kind of spectrum concepts that I noticed was happening as I wrote the book, right? So doxa could be kind of the mean of rhetoric's range. And the doxastic in general composes a variety of scales. So from less social or socialized to more social. And trust me, I'm going to get way more complicated because we're going to start to talk about algorithms in a second, right? Acceptability, less common to more common, publicity, how public facing are these opinions, and objectivity, which is not a word that rhetoricians like. But it is an interesting word to think about when it comes to your sense of reality, right? And not just from a naive realist point of view, but like literally, what do you think is true? I mean, it's a hard question. So now I'm going to walk you through some examples. I'm going to go through kind of each chapter really quickly and show you either the examples I was working on in the book, or I'm going to show you kind of contemporary applications of what I'm offering in this book. Chapter 1, Doxa plus sociality. All of the chapters are Doxa plus, and then they have some kind of big site of inquiry that would be attractive to humanities scholars in general. Doxa plus sociality is the book's foundation. It's where I outline that spectrum of opinions, and I really kind of focus on what are opinions not, and by that I mean what are these adoxa, right? And how do we understand these technically weak opinions? Because It might be surprising for some of you to understand that opinions have traditionally been thought of as crucial to public relationality. And so a doxa are things that would detract from being social, right? So a pretty bold counterclaim in this chapter is it's been a doxa and not opinions that Plato was really concerned about when it came to rhetoric. And this is a concern that's reverberated throughout the whole of Western thought. So I go back to Plato's Gorgias, and from this examination, I realize, and I kind of make it clear, opinions shift. They transform in their register along that spectrum that I was just talking about. But now it's not Platonic dialogue that's moving these opinions kind of back and forth. It's social media affordances and how those affordances blur boundaries between improbable and highly probable opinions. So because of algorithms, what might have looked like an isolated opinion now could resonate as what Tena Bucher calls a programmed sociality. We can learn more about opinions and how they become mobile from their interactions with algorithms. And so this chapter looks at Google search algorithms in particular, because they are taking these kind of isolated, ill-formed opinions, and they're transforming them into widespread ill-formed opinions, blending adoxa and doxa and doxa, right? So of course, to do digital rhetoric scholarship as I do is to always be interrogating big tech's performance of the rhetoric of plainness and neutrality, which of course is just a performance, right? Their tools and their power are anything but neutral. The rhetorical tools by which the Google search algorithms package information resonate as logos, right? So popular findings comprise top findings, and that taps into a culturally ingrained expectation between what is right and what is popular. But of course, Google doesn't call these algorithms popular algorithms, right? They call them freshness algorithms. Google has been playing this game for a very long time, right? This is a 2011 blog post announcing, how are these algorithms helping us out with search results? And they're comparing search results to warm cookies. And as I always tell students in my digital rhetoric class, a search engine that feels the need to make a comparison between their tools and warm cookies might be more accurately described as a revenue generating advertising company than a search engine, right? And here in their 10 things we know to be true company philosophy, right? They write, our users trust our objectivity, and no short-term gain could ever justify breaching that trust. I mean, this is a silicon ideology that permeates all of these big tech companies, and it's quite alarming. They're kind of just saying the quiet part out loud. Google search algorithms, and now something like AI overview, are not just delivering information, they are constituting information, which has implications for how we parse and evaluate opinions. The techniques of digital platforms will determine how and to what extent opinions change. Algorithmic sociality means that every opinion now enjoys attention and then distribution. The ways algorithms socialize bad opinions through circulation ends up suggesting a fundamental relationality among isolated opinions and widely accepted opinions. In chapter 1, I argue algorithmic sociality reveals that adoxa are not opposed to endoxa. Because of looking at algorithms, adoxa emerge within and relation to widely accepted opinions, precisely because algorithms assign each opinion rank and relevance. Algorithms are designed to scope out relevant information, and by doing that, they are changing what we understand as information, and they are changing our relationship to what we believe. So the second chapter claims that opinions are synonymous. They become synonymous with ideology. So because of Pierre Bourdieu, in my argument, Pierre Bourdieu kind of received this concept of doxa and then made it into a synonym for ideology. And that's contributed to scholars really misunderstanding how complicated doxa and opinions are. I've even seen scholars attributing doxa to Pierre Bourdieu, and I'm like, y'all know that this is an ancient Greek concept, right? And so this chapter is really arguing, okay, yes, doxa are ideological, but they are not reducible to ideology. And in order to make this argument, I argue through the help of Roland Barthes, Lauren Berlant, doxa are infrastructural. They are the grounds that scaffold all of our actions on social media. They are the reason why you look away from a TikTok, or you zoom into a photo, or you swipe left, you swipe right, right? They are literally the grounds for what we are traveling in order to do any of these things. And we should, be thinking about that, because they directly impact external structures as well, right? So if Facebook is updating their reaction buttons after the pandemic, or TikTok is implementing a new slideshow feature, we have a sense that these pathways that were traveled are in fact impacting users and digital external structures. Doxa are infrastructural. And in this chapter, I was actually looking at a short film from 2013 that's like all on a desktop. So like the POV and the camera is somebody's cursor. The music is somebody's iTunes playlist, right? It's really interesting. But a contemporary update to that might be the amazing Janice Bravo's 2020 film Zola, right? And I'm interested in this film for a lot of reasons. I think it's one of the smartest films about racial relations in America. But it's also really fascinating how the kind of formal elements of the film itself interrupt and scaffold the plot and the narrative, so much so that you get a sense that, the notification sound that's constantly interrupting is also a part of a character's motivation to do something or not do something. Or the fact that we look at a moment, and it looks like a screen is overlaying that moment, and you get a sense, okay, this is a part of why these people are doing what they're doing, right? The third chapter looks at doxa and bodies, and it claims that opinions and bodies have always been mutually informing. And in fact, if you look at Plato, right, he talks about opinions as puppeteer of sinew. And Hannah Arendt has also taken that and created a concept of the sixth sense that we all hold in common. So I build off of that to suggest opinions become a bodily reasoning through habitual repeated actions with platforms, and they resonate as a sixth sense. And the big takeaway here is we're starting to get, now that it's chapter 3, we're getting into Lewisian territory. Chapter 3 and chapter 4 start to feel a little woo-woo, but I have real interesting and concrete examples for how I'm theorizing these phenomena. So chapter 3 argues opinions are asignifying structures. So what I mean by that is we often think of opinions as, just these things like you can pluck them when you need them. They're just sitting right there. If you need an opinion, you just grab it. It's the same. It stays the same, right? But I argue opinions are emergent. Opinions emerge through an interaction and through an encounter, right? And they emerge singularly in that encounter. And if you're hearing Deleuze, you're correct. Aaron Manning Deleuze is very heavy in this chapter. So I might be looking at a TikTok, and suddenly an opinion becomes kind of feisty in that encounter, right? It's the affectations of these opinions that become sort of animating an intuitive bodily mode of what rhetoricians would call a topical invention, a bodily invention, right? A sense of like, my body is kind of taking the wheel right now. And examples of this kind of topical invention can seem really nonsensical. In the book, I'm looking at people misunderstanding satire as if it's genuine, and they're responding as if it's genuine, or misunderstanding conspiracy discourse and kind of falling in line with it. But I still argue that this topical invention is a form of bodily knowledge that has learned how to sense opinions, which is a sensing of what the platforms expect from you. So here's a pretty kind of striking example. This is a now deleted QAnon subreddit forum, right? And as we know, Biden's inauguration did not go the way that some of these QAnon believers thought it would, right? And studying opinions makes you really empathetic. It makes you really able to grasp how complex and nuanced everything is. And you think about that person who was telling everybody that they love, like, look, this is going to happen. I promise this is going to happen in this way. And then they've gathered all these people, and these people are like, well, what's happening? It's not happening the way you said it would, right? That could be really traumatic and really difficult to kind of grapple with. And so you see this one particular thread where someone writes, can someone post a link to the part that says, if Biden is inaugurated, that we lost, right? They're just totally out to sea at this point. They don't know how to feel. They don't know what to think, right? And I write, it always seems like platforms try to exploit the fact that people have opinions. But really, platforms exploit the fact that people feel increasingly alone with their opinions. And that's the gotcha there. That's the gotcha. A huge part of this story of opinions and tripping down the rabbit hole and becoming radicalized is looking at what platforms were doing around the 2016 US presidential election, right? Because I think that moment, and when Trump was deplatformed in 2021 from Twitter, those are moments where people kind of became alive and awoke to a sense of what platform moderation does and can do. And it's interesting to look at the public facing community guidelines from that time, from 2016 to 2018, because as I'm arguing this chapter, social media bodies learned with these updates, learned with the techniques. So at the same time that platforms were kind of giving their own common sense of like, hey, just do whatever, like we'll figure it out together, it's all good. They were also algorithmically rewarding the most outlandish content, right? And so our bodies were all learning, if we wanted views, if we wanted visibility, we had to learn to play the game, the algorithmic game, right? So what became reasonable was the user who learned to click on everything, who learned to comment on everything and to follow everything. And as a response, these guidelines become deontological because they're realizing, oh, we can't actually control these bodies, these users, right? Here's a really striking example of just kind of what I'm talking about, building on Tarleton Gillespie's work, right? This is the 2016-2018 tone. You can see it's extremely casual. They're just like, hey, chill, like we're cool, keep it respectful, and compare that to contemporary platform guidelines where it's strikingly different, right? I mean, you look at meta guidelines, and beside the fact that I don't know what authentic or inauthentic content even means, they have appendices for appendices, right? They are so long and so total, or they're trying to perform totalizing moderation. So, I mean, this is just a wild kind of example. Doxa in Time is the fourth chapter. And that's where I was kind of thinking about virality and internet outrage. And in this chapter, I'm kind of arguing, again, it's getting a little woo-woo, but that opinions have a latency, and that they have their own time to activate. And once you get several opinions activating all at once, that can be thought of as a form of internet virality, right? So the big claim in this chapter is that I'm claiming opinions are autopoietic. They produce themselves. And I'm going to show you an example for Meta and AI, right? So AI features that Meta just rolls out because, why not? No problem there, right? If you look at content that is actually AI generated, or maybe it's AstroTurf content, so it's been paid for, the visible impressions are still going to have an impact on you, right? It could be the psychological effect of like the mere exposure effect, right? Where you see something once, you see it again, it feels familiar to us feels persuasive, or if it feels seamless, cognitive scientists are aware of how seamless something is, can generate suasion and persuasiveness. So here, we've got classic meta AI generated content. And you'll see that the comments, like it's clear that some of these are AI generated comments, but some of them aren't. And no matter what, they're all being taken together by people who are seeing this. I mean, they're informing my opinion, right? Like I see something like that, and an opinion hardens in my encounter with that. I'm just kind of like, wow, meta, like, could you get worse, right? Could you get more zombified? Other people are seeing that, and maybe their sense of what they love about America is growing, or their sense of like, what is this representing about fatherhood? It's kind of, you know, folding in that moment. So really interesting stuff. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. Finally, the last chapter considers, you know, what's Doxa's original role in terms of argumentation. Sometimes we have to change opinions. And this was really the heyday of hashtag activism. I was looking at Ferguson protests on Twitter, hashtag if they gun me down, which interestingly had a resurgence in 2020. And I'm arguing that, you know, you have to kind of produce friction between doxa if you want to spark some moment of unrecognizable unrecognizability, right? A current update to this chapter would be something I'm working on now with feminist data healing strategies spearheaded by the self-described guerrilla theorist and curator Nema Gutierrez. So her data healing workbook is part of this larger community of artists and thinkers who are trying to defy big tech logics, right? And you can see that even in the composition of something like this, things are getting juxtaposed and intensified through that juxtaposition. And I think it's really exciting stuff to think about. So getting to the end here, opinions are always going to be essential to everyday arguments and the most vital arguments. But social media opinions have been diluted by the attention economy, platform moderation, proprietary algorithmic actions, and hierarchical data archiving. Our current problems with opinions are actually problems with the slippage between opinions and opinions that have amassed questionable qualities from big tech processing, where the dominant ethic is not education or connection, but mere engagement. When we pin isolation onto these social media opinions, maybe we're just fed up with algorithms narrowing our networks. When we accuse social media opinions of being too loud, maybe we can't stand feeling commodified by snippets of data that should have been private. When we complain that social media opinions are uninformed, maybe we're realizing that we are and have always been more complicated than any of this marketing would have us believe. So for future reference, and to end my talk today, inventing on social media must be a process of making opinions unrecognizable so that we ourselves become unrecognizable. But what that really requires is returning opinions to their states of complexity. Social media tricked us into thinking that social media opinions are actual opinions, when opinions have never been straightforward, isolating, or universal. And as a lot of digital art demonstrates, and I get into that in my last chapter, once we grant opinions the room to interact, to spread out and occupy space, we make glitches, in Legacy Russell's terms, we make glitches out of what the machine thinks opinions are. And with glitched opinions, we fail to function for a machine that was never meant to work for us. The machine cannot monetize the extremes of ambiguity. The machine cannot predict violent ruptures. The machine cannot feel the depths of inheritances or appreciate contradictions. But with Doxa, we can. With Doxa, we will. So thank you so much. Feel free to contact me after the talk. Any questions or comments? Yeah, I can't wait to have a conversation with you all.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Alford, for this wonderful introduction to your book. Still trying to wrap my brain around so many complexities of your study. Before we get more granular, one question I'd like to ask our authors is about the genealogy of the project. And then to sort of complement that, I see we have Alex Kina here, a political scientist, our colleague in poli-sci, and other colleagues in poli-sci who probably have the same question about, how your framework is very relevant now to our election season. So these are two possible questions. You can start, wherever you are. In the meantime, folks will keep posting questions in Q&A. Thank you.
So do you mean like kind of scholarly genealogy?
Yeah. How did this happen, right?
Oh,
What's the spark of the idea? How did we get here?
yeah, that's a really good question. I could see somebody doing a book on doxa and opinions by making it kind of like a rhetorical history, right? And kind of tracing it through each rhetorical period. Um, I I'm a theory head, so I think with associations, right? I'm always kind of thinking transdisciplinarily. And so I had this like body of rhetorical studies scholarship. And then I also had these emergent social media phenomena and logics, right? And something that I think is really important to do with any kind of rhetorical studies scholarship is how do we create some kind of dialogue between the two where rhetorical studies is shedding light on social media, but social media is also shedding light on rhetorical studies, right? A lot of what I understand about doxa and opinions now I would not have understood, right, if I were not engaging some of these phenomena. So, for example, at one point in the book, I look at an example of like astroturfing, which is when, engagement on social media is paid for, probably by a political party, right? And I was looking at this case study that was looking at Boris Johnson's engagement on his Facebook page compared to his predecessor, Theresa May. And you're looking at the engagement with Boris Johnson, and it's all like, good job, brilliant, good job. It's like totally the same, right? It's uniform, right? And that suggests that it was paid for. And then you're looking at Theresa May and it's like everything you'd expect from human comments, right? It's like awful violence and also like funny typos and things like that. One of these is probably falsified and one of these is probably genuine. However, when it comes to opinions, it almost doesn't matter in terms of how it's impacting the people who are seeing both of these, right? We're seeing things that are acting on us rhetorically. We're seeing numbers, we're seeing impressions, we're seeing people forming consensus right in front of us, and it's effective, right? It's affecting us. So I know I kind of pull from both pools, and I'm always kind of pulling from receptions, theoretical receptions. So Roland Barthes figures pretty heavily. Obviously, Pierre Bourdieu figures pretty heavily. And then I'm just also trying to figure out how media studies can factor in. And if I were to do like a part 2 of the book, it would be, I think, much more media studies focused.
Mhm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll get back to the political question, to the November context in a few, as I try to reformulate that question. Alex, if you'd like to ask your version of that question, please post it in the chat. In the meantime, let's go to Timothy Barr, one of our guests today, who is asking the following. They say, I'm curious about making opinions unrecognizable. It seems like one of the issues you've pointed out is that doxa/opinion is undervalued, and people seek to represent their own positions as fact and other devalued positions as mere opinion. So the question is, what is the imagined outcome for recognition in your proposed model?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's kind of why in my last chapter I turned to digital art, because I think in art, we can kind of speculate and we can kind of see, we can play and we can try things out that maybe aren't being tried out in just day-to-day life, right? And I was looking at a particular photography project called geolocation, in which the photographers were taking publicly available geolocation metadata from tweets, right? And they were going to those coordinates and taking a photo. And of course, the artistic liberty comes from like, they have no idea where this person was looking when they compose that tweet, right? But they're taking a photo and they're deciding like, this is where we're going to do it. And then they include, without identification, they include the original language of the tweet. And I was looking at one that came from the aftermath of the shooting at the Pulse nightclub, right? And there's this incredibly desolate photo, right? And the tweet is something about like, love is love, right? And so of course you're starting to think, okay, this person isn't queer. They don't really feel all that concerned because love is pretty like neutral and whatever. It's just bandwagon behavior, right? But then the photo itself, everything about it suggests that like, not everything is what it seems, right? There's a sign that says no trespassers allowed, but it's like leaning, and then there's a traffic barricade, but it doesn't really seem all that solid. And so it really just begs the question, like, you can't land on an opinion here. You don't know who this user is. You don't know how much reflection went into this. You don't know how they feel about this particular atrocity, right? Except the platforms are telling us you do know how to feel, even if we don't, right? Like the platforms are just wanting us to have an opinion, even when we don't have enough to go on, right? Something I tell my students all the time is like, it is so liberating sometimes to be like, you know what? I don't know enough to have an opinion right now. Like I need to have more conversations. I need to do a bit more reading and listening and talking. And I just need to kind of be quiet. But the platforms are trying to outrage us. They're trying to get us locked in for longer. And because of that, our bodies are attuned to like form that opinion, do it, And so making something unrecognizable is kind of in the realm of art. I'd be interested to look more at digital art, but it's also kind of going back to those data healing strategies that I'm looking at. Like I'm really interested in user generated interventions that acknowledge this is how big tech is working on us, and this is how we are going to work alongside it and against it.
Project number 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer. Our next question is from Frankie Mastrangelo. Sorry, mispronounced your name, Frankie. Thank you so much for being here. When you noted how platforms exploit how people feel, increasingly alone with their opinions, Frankie says, I thought of how Naomi Klein says, quote, conspiracy theories get the facts wrong, but the feelings right.
Yeah.
And Frankie continues, I consider how conspiracy thinking often offers silver bullet solutions to complex problems. So the question is, how do you see this gravitation toward conspiracy thinking really undermining the potential for returning opinions to a state of complexity?
Yeah, I am obsessed with Naomi Klein's book. Like, if you haven't read it, it's the smartest kind of take on how we got here post pandemic. And something she's looking at is really something I was interested in, which is when people feel lost, how are the techniques organizing them into situations that will really just like pick at those raw pressure points, right? And they are pressure points. And that's the kind of sad thing, is that I could sit here with somebody who maybe I don't agree with, right? And we could both agree, like, there's a problem with big pharma, for instance, right? But then that person goes in a wildly different direction and says, yeah, and because of that, I'm not going to get vaccinated, right? And I'm not going to go in that direction. But we both feel the pain of feeling like something's not right. And that pain is getting exploited by, for instance, Facebook private groups. Some of the most horrible things that have happened in the last 4 years can be traced to how Facebook organizes people into this, right? You could say, hey, I'm interested, as you're filling out your profile and putting it together, like I'm interested in parenting and football. And suddenly you're recommended a group and the group seems harmless and you get into it, but then you kind of say, oh, I'm a little worried about vaccinations, and someone is like, oh, well, in that case I have a group for you to join. And then it gets worse and worse and worse. And of course we know this, like YouTube has been doing this forever, where the goal is always to make the opinion more extreme, right? The goal is always, okay, you're interested in cooking fresh vegetarian meals. Well, here's how you become a raw vegan who only eats once a day, right? Like in 5 videos, that's the recommendation in 5 videos, you know? And so it's always taking these opinions and these pains that we have. And honestly, like as Max Fisher writes in his book on social media, it's a mood altering drug, truly. Like we are truly walking around having been altered by this mood altering drug. And so it's good to kind of take notice, especially of those bodily senses and those bodily reactions, where if you just start to feel like flushed, or you start to feel tense, or you're grinding your teeth, or like you feel empty, I don't know, anything like that can be a cue that these opinions are getting less complex and being warped into something that's like easy on the surface.
Excellent answer. Thank you so much for both the question and the answer. We have time for only 2 more questions. So next up, we'll go to our colleague, also in sociology, Ing Chao Kao, and then we'll end with Mimi's question. Ing Chao says, thank you so much for the informative presentation. May I ask, in the word of Doxa spectrum, is there still any distance between the subjective and the objective? When the social media discourses are interpreted as opinions, how do the roles of verifiable and falsifiable evidence still matter? Or to put this in even more philosophical terms, do thinkers still need to draw distinctions between the evidence-less assertions and speculations and the evidence-based reasoning, arguments, and analysis? Thank you, Ying Chao. This is a great question.
Oh, this could be like lots of conversations, lots of talks, right? First of all, I will note that what we think of as evidence is also way more complicated. If you're interested in the question of how evidence works, it's not just something like we pull on, right? My colleague Jenny Rice's book, Awful Archives, is a really good place to go to think about conspiracy discourse and the accumulation of evidence, right? So it's not, and also we know rhetorically that people are not persuaded by fact checking, right? Fact checking presumes that words correlate to reality when we have always known that words do not correlate to reality. There's no correspondence there. It's not about a truth function, you know? So it's really about things like sociological questions of like lived experience. What do you see when you walk out the door? Who do you meet when you walk out the door? I think the question right now of the horrible disinformation about the Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio is a really troubling example of this, because this is somebody who, you know, maybe it started out like, I have this feeling, I don't know how to process this feeling. I'm going to go to this private group and talk about how, like, I think there might have been a rumor, right? And how does that then get turned into a doxa that is also widely accepted, right? So widely accepted that it's literally being turned on and circulated in a presidential debate, right? At the end of the day, though, I would say that a doxa, so these technically implausible opinions, they have a kernel of something there. They're not coming from nowhere. That would be ridiculous, right? So there's something there that needs to be teased out. And this is where it's really scary to think about people going to like Google search and like, or TikTok, and being like, how do I find out more information about this? And then they get their bad opinion kind of distributed and then organized, right? They get organized with people who feel that way too. And then it feels stronger, like, oh, well, a lot of people believe what I believe, right? So it's very complicated when you think about evidence. But yeah, the two, subjective and objective, they're all kind of intertwined when it comes to opinions.
Thank you. One last question, Mimi Winnick, who also says, congratulations on publication of your book. I'm excited about it. I wonder, though, how do you address strong sixth sense feelings in class, say in discussions that bring up students' feelings of loneliness in their own opinions? In other words, how do students' feelings come up in class, and how do you work with them to help them learn and to also keep the class from, well, derailing?
Yeah,
Great question.
that's a really great question. The best thing to do in class is always to bring things back to the text, right? So that it's never just I have this opinion and I'm sharing this opinion, and I don't care how it makes you feel, and I don't care how you feel talking about your opinions, right? In fact, we're always going to be looking at something that we are analyzing and that we can discuss in terms of what's the strategy here? What are the opinions being kind of produced here, right? So if I want to talk about the ideology of big tech, I'm not just going to talk about it in abstract ways. I'm going to look at Elon Musk's emails because they exist, and we can look at them and we can analyze what is the ideology that comes into this when he's addressing employees at his company in this very, condescending way, like truly objectively condescending way, right? So always kind of bringing it back to some anchor, and also just having very open and vulnerable recognitions that opinions, the reason why it's so hard to have conversations about opinions is that they come from these very deep bodily places. And that's why sometimes it's so hard to talk to somebody who agrees about something that you're like, oh my God, that's totally antithetical to who I am, right? Because your body gets involved. And then you're up to here, and you have a hard time articulating where you're coming from, or even just trying to listen to the other person. So having those conversations early on in honestly, in any classroom that's going to, bring conversations around opinions into play, having that conversation early on. There's a really good article called Rhetoric is Love, which it's from the 80s. It's kind of a woo-woo article, but it's by Jim Corder, and it kind of gets at that feeling of trying to reach across to somebody who says something very different from what you think, and why that's so challenging. So if you even just have students read like a paragraph from that article and just be like, how does it feel when someone says something you don't agree with, right? And laying the groundwork so that you can then have anchors with like primary sources, right?